Thank you for the invitation. I'm quite pleased to spend about 2 hours with you and the coming evening. As you've been saying, I work in a private think tank, which I founded about 20 years ago. Previous to that, I was working at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a diplomat and working at the Policy Planning Office. And that was very interesting. That gave me the envy, the taste to think about the future. But how can we think about the future seriously, on a very rigorous manner? Because when one thinks about the future, we always make mistakes. So we are trying in the LEPAC think tank to do so. We've been publishing 4 years ago an atlas, a big atlas, named 2033, Atlas of the Future of the World, and the future on its plural. And the next volume will come in November, and it will be 2038, and we are trying to think about what are the main trends. So this is a part of these researches, mainly focused on cities and mobility in cities, and I'm going to try to sum up today. So our work is to make synthesis and sometimes analysis, diagnosis, foresight, and knowledge transmission. I think it's extremely important. Don't forget to put your mobile phone on the silent mode. I suggest that we speak about something which is extremely important and I think underestimated when you're trying to make some foresight. It is demography. Demography is a very big ship, very slow to move, but it moves. It moves, and differently according to the continents. So this is what I'm going to show you. I'm going to speak about the global wealth, because it is a part of what makes cities growing. We'll speak about the urban civilization, of course, and where is it going to grow? In Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. I will speak about something extremely important. This is what we can call the new middle classes in the world. And you will see we have a graph quite interesting showing that there's a balance. There's a real shift between where are the middle classes in the world. And I'll speak about new cities, and just to be provocative, new cities, old means of transportation, and old cities, new means of transportation. There's an interrogation mark, just to be modest and try to be provocative. But anyway, when you study the thing, there are a few trends that you can see behind the curtain. And of course, I'll speak about energy and pollution and climate change. So one of the important things is to have an approach, what I call a systemic approach. Don't think, as we too often do, the French people, thinks that being vertical. Think the links between the data, and that helps to understand, and to make the link between demography and urbanization, demography and migrations, food, of course. What about water? Water and energy, energy and climate. Everything is linked, and I think this is the proper approach to try to understand, and not to be, how could I say, to be scared. To be scared about the evolution that we see in the world. And sometimes we have the feeling that they are too quick or too violent. So I think the systemic approach gives some methodology to approach these problems. Demography. You can see on this graph, when I was born, there were 2.5 billion inhabitants. Now, more than 7. But what you can note that the speediness of growth is much slower now. We go from 7 to 8.5, but at the 20th century we're going from 2.5 to 7. And this growth is going slower and slower. And we will reach a sort of, how could I say, a plateau in 2050, about 9-10 billion inhabitants. Why? Because of the demographic transition. And the demographic transition, which is roughly all over the world, roughly, a balance between birth rate and mortality. And of course, there is one good balance, and the good balance, it is the birth rate, which is 2.1 average kids per woman in the society in order to regenerate this society. But you have many countries in the world that are under 1.4, Germany, Japan, Russia, and it is a big problem. But you have a few problems that are widely above. They didn't get into the demographic transition yet. Egypt, Pakistan, Nigeria. But roughly, the whole world since about 30 years is inside this process of demographic transition because of a certain number of factors. One of the factors, it is school. The more the youngs are going to school, the more you can see the curve of demography going, I'd say, more reasonable or going down. So this is why the speed of growth of the world population at the 21st century is not at all as quick as the one we've been knowing and being the witness at the 20th century. There's been here a revolution at the 19th century of the world population because of cities, because of the Industrial Revolution, because of public wealth. That makes that usually women used to have 5 kids and 4 were dying. And from the middle of 19th century, they were still having 5 kids, but they were keeping 4 out of them. And that is why we've been having this incredible curve and incredible going up of the world population. But that won't be that way at the 21st century. Now, if we look at the proportion of the population, I'm going to show you a certain number of what we call cartogram, anamorphosis map. You modify the size of the country according to what kind of data you put in it. That could be a bathroom, that could be McDonald's restaurants. But here, this is the population. In proportion, okay? But in the 1950, you can see that, for instance, Europe is 18% of the world population, and Africa 8.5%, India 18%, and China 23%, okay? Now, if we go nowadays, Europe is already 8.5%, no more 18%. Africa has been jumping from 8 to 15. India is 23, and China is going down. China is only 21% of the world population. At the 18th century, 19th century, it was 35% of the world population. So don't be anxious about Chinese population. It's going down for a certain number of reasons. And in 10 years' time, the first countries in terms of population, it will be India. Now, if we look in 40 years' time, what do we have? Europe will be 6% of the world population. And I think that's very interesting in terms of cities and coming cities. Africa, look, it's jumped from 15 to 22. India, I've been speaking about that. And China will be 16% of the world population. And that gives a sort of general trend of where and how the cities are going to settle in the decades to come. And this is the sort of broad picture I'm trying to give you. Now, the other trend it is important to have in mind is the fact that distribution of the world population by age under 1 century, the world is getting old. The world is getting old. And you can see... Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Did you hear me anyway? Because I can start it again. No, I was very anxious about that. And in one way, it's a good news, because that means that we have a growing of the life expectancy. But you can see on this graph, now we are here. The yellow, it is the base of our pyramid, the youngest people. And you can see that we have less birth than 20 years ago. And above the pink side of the graph, these are elder people, more than 60 years old. And you can see that the more we go, the more we are going to have elder people in the world. In Europe, it is very specific. I won't have time to speak about the demography in Europe, but it's a real problem. But globally, you have to be aware that the world is getting old. And I wanted to mention this because this has consequences, once again, on the cities and how people are moving in these cities. If you have 20 to 25% of the world population which is more than 60 years old, that makes a very big difference compared to the 60s or to the 70s. So, a growing population in the world, much slower, and a population getting older than before. Now, distribution of global wealth by country. Let me give you an explanation, because these are drawings, these trends, sometimes people are a little bit afraid. Don't be afraid, because this is GDP and this is a ranking. Because, for instance, the GDP of the United States from these days until 2050 is growing. It's growing. But the ranking of the United States is moving. This is the same in Europe, but this is not the same, of course, in China, and in India, or in Brazil. You see, for instance, Japan is losing the 4th place, if I may say so, but the GDP of the state is growing, but it is not at the same ranking. So if we put it another way, there you have the economical geography of the world in the decades to come. And that, to me, very interesting and very important to have in mind, because we are shifting.
Is there on your side, sir? This side.
Thank you very much. We are shifting from a world oriented on the Atlantic to a world oriented to Asia Pacific. And that's a very big difference. for the cities, for the business, for demography, and for even international politics. So you have the BRICS. Everybody knows what does that mean? Brazil, Russia, India, China. But you have the new emerging countries. Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Turkey, northern part of Mexico. So that's a new map of the economy of the world. Now, what does that bring? That brings the evolution of middle classes. On this graph, this is 1970 and this is 2030, okay? And now we are here. So what I'm trying to show with this graph is 20 years ago, 80% of the middle classes were in OECD countries, which is our countries. And what's happening now, which is a very interesting trend, is we have a shift. That the new middle classes are in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. And if we move this graph, so this is what I could say the former middle classes, okay? And these are the new middle classes. And you can see that in nowadays, and the coming 10 years, that 70–80% of the middle classes in the world will be in China, or the part of Asia, in India, in North Africa, Middle East, Other America, Brazil, Mexico. And that's a very important shift. But be careful, I'm not saying that these middle class to which we belong are getting poorer and poorer. I'm not saying this. I'm saying there's a sort of rebalancing of the wealth in the world. We have an expression in French, and I don't know how to translate it in English. We say it, les 30 glorieuses, the 3 decades which were easy in Europe and in France from, let's say, 1950 to 1980, etc. And now it's finished. No, it's beginning, but not for us. Not for us. And that's also very good news. That's also very good news. We have a sort of shift and a rebalancing of the, how could I say, equilibrium of the economies of the world. And I think it's quite good news. So, I've been saying all of this. What are the consequences for the cities, which is your main topic? I've been working with the Department of Maps with ARTE. You've kindly been saying that we have a weekly program using maps to explain how things are going in the world. And some of these maps, I've been preparing them with my friends of ARTE. And you were having, let's put it, in 1980, 40% of the world population was in cities, okay? In 1910, only 20%. 1950, 30%, 40%. Nowadays, it's a little bit more than half. And in 40 years' time, about 70%, 65% of the world population will be living in cities. So once again, this is what we call the urban civilization, the urban spaces. Can you imagine all of this, what it means, for the good and for the bad? You were speaking about flux and flows, how to handle these flux and flows. And I have in mind the water, the energy, the garbage. But altogether, that brings a certain number of solutions, and also in terms of ecology. So let's keep on the demonstration. I want to show you a little animation that you will see the growing of the cities from 1950 to 2050. Look carefully. Now we are back to 2010. Okay, this is nowadays. And the figures that you see there, this is the part of the population that lives in the country. This is not the global population of India or China. I like it, so I'll do it again. So that's quite impressive. But the main thing I want to show you that the big growth of cities, it is not in OECD countries. It is not in Europe, and it is not in the United States. It's still growing, but much, much, much more slower than in, let's say, emerging countries and developing countries. If you look at the distribution of urban and rural population by region, now we are in the 50, and now days were here. And what you can note, it's in blue, this is OECD countries. And it is quite stable for rural population and urban population as well. But the main growing, of course, is here. And this is urban population from, let's say, less developed region. But the more we go, the more they are developing. Now, what we can see here, it's not easy to read, but it is the growth of the GDP of cities. And what you have in yellow, the growth is important and goes from 0 to 100. From the orange, from 100 to 250%. And the red is exploding their GDP. And where are they? I mean, there's no surprise. They are in India, in China, and at the eastern part of China. So you're going to have here, and you have already, new cities, big cities, and with huge GDP per city. And when I'm speaking about GDP of city, that's quite important. For instance, the GDP of Shanghai is about $260 billion. And this is the equivalent of the GDP of Finland. So this is quite important and important to have in mind. Of course, it is connected with pollution. I will end my lecture speaking about climate, energy, cities, and pollution. But we have a very accurate data, and this is quite important. All of you are aware of the level of pollution in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Mexico, and some other big cities of the world. Now, I want to speak about the cities by themselves, speak a brief period of time of the new cities, how are they going to develop, and how it's going to be possible to move in these cities. And after that, I will speak about our old cities. I've been searching some of films and drawings showing the cities, how they will be. And in 1927, this is how Fritz Lang was seeing the coming city, metropolis. The American drawer, Klaus Bertel, in 1959, he drew the city of 76. So this is how he was seeing it. And I think that's quite nice drawing and quite accurate. And I've been finding also, you know, the newspaper in France named Paris Match, being published in 1967 and saying, this is Paris in 20 years. So this is how a newspaper was publishing how Le Quartier de la Défense was supposed to be 20 years from now. But for God's sake, he made a complete mistake. And so much the better, because there's no imagination at all in this drawing. This is just a way to copy a very classical model of architecture and urbanism after the war. And for God's sake, it's a mistake. So look at the La Défense today. It is much better than the mistakes of Paris Match. Now, I want to show you what we call the coming winning cities. The coming winning cities, it is the cities that sometimes we don't have in mind, but that are very much growing in population and in wealth. And surprisingly, we have Curitiba, that you know, Montevideo, but also Panama City. Do remember that there's a new canal in Panama that is going to be boosted because of the extra width of the canal. Are you aware also that there's a very possible Chinese investment to open a new canal in Nicaragua? Did you hear about that? And I don't know if it will take place, but this is very interesting, with Chinese financing. So you can see here a certain number of cities and coming cities. So if we try to understand how it works and what are the criteria, we can have a look to this graph, and I want to say a word about it. This is from what we call the Kearney Global Cities Index. And it's possible to read it. Don't be afraid. I'll say a word about it. So you have New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, and then Mexico City, Geneva, Taipei, and so on and so forth. I don't know if you can read all of it. But the interesting things, these are the criteria. The criteria in red, this is business activity. In blue-gray, this is human capital, university, training, school. In green, this is your department. This is exchange, information exchange, and mobility in the city. In yellow, you have what they call the cultural experience. Of course, it's very important. And in gray, again, what they call political engagement. And the political engagement of the city is how the city is trying to play a role in the evolution of the world. So it is quite interesting to see this index is from 2013, and that also gives an explanation, a possible explanation about the new cities. So I want to say a word about the new cities before coming to mobility. I've been having a look to the city that's being built these days, and I have a few examples that I wanted to give you. For instance, what we call the Tianjin Eco-City. The Tianjin Eco-City is a new part of the city of Tianjin, but is supposed to organize the city with a very low level of energy consumption and a very high level of possibility of public transportation. And Tianjin Eco-City will have in 2020, means in 5 years' time, 350,000 inhabitants. So it's going very, very, very quick. Another example, it is King Abdullah City in Saudi Arabia. It's a completely new city gives a certain number of solutions, but altogether that brings the main problem, what identity for the city. This is the main contradiction between these new cities and the fact of having or not having an identity. I'll give you another example about Zhuhai. Zhuhai, you know, it's just at the northern part of Macau. You have Hong Kong and Shenzhen, the Pearl River, and on the other side you have Macau, and just northern part is Zhuhai. Zhuhai is nowadays a city of 150,000 inhabitants. In 20 years' time, there will be 4 million. 4 million. And I'm speaking about Zhuhai because my think tank is working with an urbanistic group of French, Italian, and Chinese of how can we manage that Zhuhai would be a living city, a bearable city, a pleasant city. So I'm not an urbanist, but the question that we have to answer at the think tank is, how can we imagine a young Chinese citizen living in a city in 2030? So this is the question which is asked to us. And it is, of course, extremely interesting because I think China is the only part of the world where you can really be free to imagine what sort of city to be built. Because there's space, there's money, and it is an authoritarian regime. And that helps. Not for the individual freedom, but that helps to go fast and to take some decision. And so this is a sort of, how were you saying, a sort of white sheet. And we are thinking, because I've been there and we can see the maps and the photos, it is many rivers in Zhuhai. So the idea is to imagine for 3-4 million inhabitants to move in the city partly thanks to these rivers. And not to use the overall cars, but to use boats. The Chinese we've been discussing have been saying, why don't you try to imitate Amsterdam? So it's very interesting because maybe it's a joke, but altogether they were trying to think, how can we imitate? How can we adapt? The other example I wanted to give you is Songdo. Maybe you heard about Songdo near Incheon in South Korea. And Songdo, that you can visit now, it's a growing city for, at the present time, 2 million inhabitants, have been picking up the pattern of the city from Manhattan. That's one idea. The other idea of Songdo is to have a central system to handle energy and transportation of the people. A central system to handle energy and transportation of the people. That means that, for instance, you live in a building in Songdo. It's on the East China Sea, yeah? It's on the western part of Korea. You live in Songdo, and you have one single cart. A cart for money, a card for the parking of your car, a card for your apartment, and a card that you put in a computer that brings all the data to the central system in order to facilitate the daily life. You have a single card if you want to order some vegetable, and if a single card to measure the quantity of energy you expense in your apartment. And if you spend little energy, there's a sort of competition between the inhabitants of a building, okay? And the family that spends the less energy is winning. And winning free access to the fitness center. So that sounds reasonable. That, of course, a low, little income, little expense of energy, and the more the city is compact, the less people are moving, because everything is at hand, whether walking, whether bicycle, whether buses. But the problem, if you have millions of data, available to a central system, the central system knows everything about anyone. So that's a political problem about privacy. So on the one hand, there are some advantages. On the other one, if I take the example, the Tianjin Eco-City, if you have all these data available concerning anyone, the private person, being handled by a non-democratic system, it's a real problem. It's a real problem. So let's keep on now, and to give you some elements about moving in the cities. You can see here we are in 1980. And at that time we were having 250 million cars in the world. And in 20 years' time we will have exactly that number only in China. Only in China. In blue, this is the OECD cars, I think so. No, United States. China is red. And green is OECD countries, not including the United States. So from 1980 until 20 years from now, we will shift to 1.5 billion cars in the world. And only in China, 300 million cars. Nowadays, we have 80 million cars in China. 10 years' time, there was 18 million. So I think these figures are interesting to be known. Should we make a critic? Should we just admit it? But that's also, it is necessary to put it in the computer. Now the other thing about the cities, do we learn? Do we learn from emerging countries to old European countries? The experience of how to handle the city and the mobility. It is very interesting, and that's why this is really the very central of your job, to share, to make some cross-fertilization of the experience about how to move in the city. And in that way, we could be partly optimistic. But altogether, I want to give you an example that I know. It's a city that I'm going about twice a year. It is the capital, well, it's no more the capital of Burma, Myanmar, and it's Rangoon. Burma is a country that I like very much, and Rangoon as well. And there's a huge development of the country, or mainly the capital, since the economical reform of 3-4 years ago. They didn't learn anything. They are making exactly the same mistakes than Bangkok 30 years ago. Everything is for private cars. Because when you have a middle class that have more capacity of purchasing, what do? This is exactly what we've done in the 50s. They buy a car. So I'm a little bit desperate about this example, because we have the impression that the case of Rangoon is showing that no lessons being useful. And it was possible to avoid the mistakes of Bangkok, which is just 1 hour flying away from Rangoon. Now let's keep on, because there's only 5 to 10 minutes left for me. On this graph, you can see that the type of energy being used for cars and trucks is mostly oil. Little bit of gas, little bit of electricity. So we are not very much optimistic about how to use cars and what sort of energy being used for the propulsion of the car. And if you have a look to the key of our system, which is energy, on this graph, 1970-2030, you can see the increase. Now, this is nowadays. And the answer for the demand in 2030 is coal, oil, gas. Little bit of renewable energy, increasing, and increasing very much, but not so much compared to the carbon energy. And I think this is a very bad news. I hope this graph is wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I'm afraid I'm not. We can meet again in 2030, if you like. We will compare. But that is not a very good news. That brings also the necessity to speak about peak oil. You know, the peak oil is the maximum availability of the oil in the world. And it's very difficult to know when is exactly this peak oil, according to the interest that you have. I'm thinking about the companies, but mostly about the states. It's very strange, because the states that own the reserve of oil also owns the information about their own oil. You don't have any independent assessment. So the peak oil, it's a cursor that moves. And probably it is between 2010 and 2020. But the more we go, the less we will have oil. But what I'm saying is not really true, because the cursor of the schedule of the peak oil is moving, because we find oil in Alberta, what we call heavy oil in Alberta, dans l'Orénoque. Iraq is starting again the production. Libya will start again the production. And offshore drilling also is more and more important, more important than 10 years' time. So it is not really easy to make a foresight about the end of that carbon energy. So I want to say a few words about the use of internet and how it is useful for the constructing the mobility in the cities. This map is really not beautiful, but it's quite interesting, because we see that the main networks is the same that a map of our economical world. And if you look at this graph, you see we have the world population here. We are coming back to the 7 billion and a half. And if you look at the fixed lines, the top of the fixed line was about 10 years ago, okay? And if you look now to the mobile phone, look at that. So the interesting thing is we have about 7 billion inhabitants and 7 billion mobile phones. And in 10 years' time. And that's a revolution. That's a revolution. I'm thinking about Africa, for instance. In Africa, you make business. You transfer money with your mobile phone. You have some information about your crop, thanks to the satellite images. But it's a revolution also for handling the mobilities in the cities. You know that better than I do. And the more we go, and now I'm speaking about our old cities, the more it is possible to bring information through the mobile phone in order to soften and to ease the mobilities in the cities. So about the big Greater London, I won't speak a long time, because I know we have someone from London, and he will speak about that a little bit later on. But when you study and you compare the cities, the situation of London is very interesting, because we can understand that it is about to be the most integrated public transport system in the world, with Singapore. And one of the reasons of the success of London is they've been able to have a sort of a common how could I say, governance, a common body to centralize the system. And it's more difficult in London than in Singapore. It's more difficult in London than in Singapore. So you have a very much centralized monitoring system for the car, the bus, the subway. And this is also what we can be witness of, for instance, in Hafen City in Hamburg, which is a very small city, but it's a very good example. In France, we have at least 3 examples that are growing in that way. The city of Nantes, the city of Besançon, the city of Grenoble. And they are trying to use a centralized handling of electric cars to be rented, electric car that could be shared, bicycle, and of course a bus network. So I'm running out of my time, so I would like to make a conclusion. I wanted to speak about Beddington in London, so maybe we will come back to it during the debate. And I would like to end about what we call the Sky Train, or the Sky Tram. It's more than a project, it's much more than an idea, because it works in Medellin, it works in Bogota, and the idea is to use, how do you say in English, téléphérique? Cable car? Cable car is to use cable car to move in the city. And it is, of course, very interesting if there are hills in the cities, but it's been studied very quietly, for instance, in Rio de Janeiro. And it works very well in Medellin and in Bogota. And there are some discussion at the present time between POMA, Eiffage, and the city of Grenoble to settle a cable car in order to move more softly and freely in the city of Grenoble. You know, Grenoble is living in a sort of a basin, you know, and it's very, very much polluted because there are many mountains and there are many, many trucks that go through Grenoble. So the idea is to completely reshuffle the way of mobility in Grenoble, being helped by the cable car. But the idea of the new cable car is to adapt it and to meet the train. So you move in the air, and then you drop here, and you're handled to the train. So we have some images which are quite interesting, and this is a sort of a model, a pattern for the discussion with the city of Grenoble. With stations, big stations. So funny enough, we come back. You know, one of the difficulties in France, I don't know how is it in Brazil or in Colombia, one of the difficulties is a lot of private people don't want their house or their apartment to have a bus going above and having the possibility to have a look into your yard and what you're doing in your yard. So we go back once again to the problem of privacy. So for some country, it is not a problem. But speaking with the people of Eiffage about that, they say one of the breaks, it is the idea, the reality or the idea of privacy. So I would like to tell you a few, so we go back, 60 years after that, we have roughly the same system. Just a few words as a conclusion, and then we can have a debate. I have one or two messages. The first message is, I don't think the world population and the growing world population is the main problem. I think the main problem is this. The main challenge is in what sort of cities these people are going to live. What sort of mobilities is going to be possible to be available for these people. And private cars cannot be the answer. Private cars cannot be any more the answer. The second message is because of the industrial sector where you live, it is quite important that you work to prepare the World Conference on Climate in December 15 in Paris. Because there's a direct link between public transport and lowering the level of CO2 emissions. And this is quite important to reduce the CO2 emission, to change the source of energy and to get away from carbon energy, and to reduce, as I was saying, the number of cars. So this is what I believe personally, deeply, but this is one of the reasons I found it very interesting to work on this topic about coming cities, new cities, and mobilities in the cities, because this is really at the center of the problem that we're going to face in the years to come, not the decades. This is the climate change. And it's a major, not only a major threat, but to me, a major problem. So how to solve this problem, you have, I think so, by the job that you do, a part of the answer. Thank you.